All right, our next is going to be our keynote presentation, so I'd like to invite Rob Carey from General Dynamics to come on up.
I guess it's still good morning. How's everybody doing? I learned something from just that panel, which I thought was pretty cool. When you walk right in, I just got here, but interesting to what CISOs say, and then what you can relate back to your own experiences. So I'm Rob Carey from General Dynamics, and we're a proud member of the Northern Virginia business community. Let me tell you a little bit about us, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Grant, who I've known for quite some time. So we're a global aerospace and defense company. We build Gulfstream jets, we build Navy destroyers, we build submarines, wireless communication systems, pretty much serve all facets of the DoD. GDIT is a trusted systems integrator and has been for more than 50 years, providing IT, systems engineering, professional services, simulation, and training to customers in defense, federal, local, civilian, state, health, homeland security, intelligence, blah, 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 blah. We're a big place, and we provide services to all of you. We're headquartered in Fairfax, Virginia, and not too far away. And along with Mission Systems, General Dynamics IT forms the Information Systems and Technology Business Group, IS&T, and the Aerospace, Combat Systems, and Marine Systems groups make up General Dynamics, about 100,000 people strong. So without further ado, let me talk about Grant. It's my honor and privilege to introduce today's keynote. Grant and I have known each other for probably 15-ish years. And we spent a lot of time, believe it or not, in the West Wing together. Where's Grant? Is he here? There he is. Okay. Oh, there he's here. So we spent a lot of time around a table in the West Wing, talking about one of the subjects you just heard. At the time was Bradley Manning's issues, WikiLeaks, and then Edward Snowden. So it was an opportunity to see what Grant knew how to do at the national level, which was very impressive. So he serves as the acting federal CISO and the Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy on the National Security Council staff. In these roles, he leads teams of cybersecurity experts who develop and oversee cross-cutting policies to enhance the nation's cybersecurity. Grant played an instrumental role in the government-wide response to the OPM cybersecurity incident in 2014 and 15. And prior to joining the White House as the cybersecurity advisor to the federal CIO, he served for 7 years as the DIA CIO. That's where I knew Grant. Grant is technically a very savvy leader. He is very capable and very conscious of delivering measured outcomes for this government and the nation. Please welcome Grant Schneider.
Rob, thank you very much for the introduction. Note to self, don't let people who've known you so long do introductions, but I appreciate it. First of all, thank you for having me here today. Pleased to be able to talk to you about a couple things with regards to cybersecurity. I want to expand a little bit on, I have two titles because I do sort of have two jobs right now, or I do actually have two jobs right now. The first one is the Acting Federal Chief Information Security Officer, which is a role within the Office of Management and Budget. It was actually created about a year ago, in September of 2016. Was the federal CISO as a political appointee. I was brought in as the deputy. With the administration turnover, General Tuhill, who was the first federal CISO, left with the administration, and I've been acting ever since. And this summer, Rob Joyce became, or earlier in the administration, Rob Joyce became the cybersecurity coordinator on the National Security Council for the president, and asked me to come over and be a senior director and serve in this senior director role on the NSC. And in the conversations, there's a fair amount of overlap in the two portfolios that I'll touch on, and really we decided that it made sense to have me dual-hatted to keep a foot in the OMB camp and to have a foot in the National Security Council camp. And that's for a couple reasons. On the National Security Council staff, our cyber directorate is It's relatively small. It's about a dozen people. We're split into essentially two teams. One team that's run by my peer, Josh Steinman, really focuses on our international relations, how we can come up with what norms of behavior are in cyberspace, how we can deter malicious actors in that space, and then what do we do from an offensive standpoint. So a little bit more on the national security and on the offensive side. I have the portfolio that we talk about as the Homeland portfolio, so more on the defensive side of the house, which includes federal cybersecurity, so cybersecurity of federal agencies. What are we doing internally to protect the data and information and systems that we hold and operate on behalf of the American people? As well as critical infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit more about critical infrastructure when I talk about the executive order, but critical infrastructure, information sharing, and then also incident response fall in my NSC portfolio. So that federal cybersecurity, and on the OMB side, from being the acting federal CISO, is completely focused on the federal agencies and what federal agencies are doing. So I want to, on the OMB side, there's really three main areas of focus that we have. So the overlap between these two roles is that federal cybersecurity and the fact that it's all about the defensive piece of what we're doing in cyberspace and how we're protecting ourselves. Within OMB, we are very much focused on three main things, and if you read the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, if you get really bored and can't fall asleep, of 2014, it talks about roles and responsibilities across the federal government for cybersecurity. And the director of OMB, there's about 6 things listed in there that Mick Mulvaney, the director, is responsible for. I think it boils down to 3 elements, though. The first is that we develop and oversee the implementation of cybersecurity policies. And the second part of that sentence is far more important than the first part. I would say 5, certainly 7 years ago, OMB stopped at the develop policy piece. It was really just about developing policies, kicked them out the door, kind of hoped that agencies would work on them and implement them, and that was about the extent of the focus on cybersecurity. The OMB team is far more focused now on that overseeing implementation of those policies, which is really obviously where it matters. Having a 3-ring binder with cybersecurity policy written on the spine is necessary and very far from being sufficient to having a secure enterprise. And so we spend a lot of time working with Department of Homeland Security, who has a whole bunch of roles and responsibilities for federal cybersecurity, far more on the operational piece, but we work very closely with our partners at Department of Homeland Security on overseeing and ensuring that agencies are making the progress they need to make and measuring how agencies are doing. Second item is that we ensure agencies are protecting their data and information commensurate with the potential risk of harm from a compromise. So essentially, make sure we're taking a risk management approach. The panel was talking earlier about to some degree alluded to the fact you can't protect everything. You need to understand what is most critical in your environment, and you need to focus your resources there. And figure out what you're going to do about that data that's either the most risky or the most important. Ask yourself hard questions. Do I still need it? For OPM, did we need 20-something years of old background investigation stuff? Data, sometimes your mitigation may be to just delete data and information that you no longer need. And then the third role from an OMB standpoint is to ensure that agencies comply with federal cybersecurity standards and directives. And so this can be things that are issued by the Office of Management and Budget, because we issue policy directives. It can be ensuring compliance with the Federal Information Security Modernization Act or other laws, ensuring that agencies are complying with binding operational directives that would be put out by the Department of Homeland Security or National Institutes of Standards and Technologies, special publications and guidance that may come out as well. And so really, it is working with the interagencies, chairing the Federal CISO Council, working with agency CIOs and agency secretaries and deputy secretaries to be sure that agencies are moving their cybersecurity portfolio in the right direction. One of the things that the administration has been very focused on from the beginning is cybersecurity. In May, the president signed an executive order on cybersecurity, on enhancing our cybersecurity, and it covered 4 main areas, and I want to touch on each of those a little bit. The first one is on federal cybersecurity, and the executive order in and of itself required about 15 deliverables, reports, studies, if you will, and implementation plans to be created by the interagency with a whole bunch of different due dates, and I'm going to talk about a handful of those. Most of the due dates have come and gone. Most of those documents have been turned in. We're in the process of staffing a number of them up to the president, and we're working to have as much transparency on those documents as we can. So while it's ultimately the president's decision on whether or not something's made public, we certainly expect a number of those documents to be made public and, again, to be transparent. But that first section of the executive order was on federal cybersecurity, and it directed agencies to do a couple things. First of all, it directed agencies to do an individual risk assessment. So to take an assessment of what is their current cybersecurity, level. Where do agency secretaries think that they are at? Where do they think their agencies are at, and how do they think they're performing? And to identify their risks and vulnerabilities as they know them. It also directed agencies to leverage the NIST cybersecurity framework for looking at their risk profile. And so I would highly recommend, if you're not familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, look it up. We're in the process, NIST is in the process of updating the framework. It was initially really crafted to be a support tool for critical infrastructure. However, it provides a lens around identifying, detecting, protecting, responding, and recovering from cyber incidents. Those are really the 5 main elements. It gives a great lens that is well understood and is something that can be talked about with the C-suite, with senior leadership of an organization to help them understand their risk profile and where they're making investments and where they need to make perhaps additional investments. So the first deliverable was for each agency to do an assessment, to turn those in or deliver them to the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Homeland Security, so that we could then, the second deliverable was for us to put together an overarching government-wide risk assessment. So where do we think the federal government is from an overarching standpoint? We worked with agencies so that what we got from the many agencies that we got input from was to boil it down to essentially a one-pager along with some additional text so that we could easily digest their information, and more importantly, or as importantly, have data and information they could use, again, for their leadership. So Office of Management and Budget and DHS have submitted to the president a document that really highlights, it anonymizes a little the data that we got from agencies, makes it a little more generic so that we could draw some conclusions and then address what are the policy needs, what are potential funding needs that we need to continue to enhance cybersecurity across the government. So that deliverable has been turned in. It's in the process of getting to the president. Now that he's back later this week, we anticipate some stuff will flow to him shortly, and then we'll be able to talk a little more about the outcomes of those deliverables. The third report that I want to talk about from a federal cybersecurity standpoint is something that was tasked by the president to the American Technology Council to look at IT modernization. As you may or may not be aware, the government, I think, owns one of everything in technology, and we keep them around forever. The historians will be very happy because they can come to the government to get all that old equipment that they need for museums in the future, because we rarely turn things off, right? We have a hard time because of our acquisition processes, our financial processes, on really being able to build and sustain and modernize our technology. Federal government spends just under $90 billion a year. At least that's what's easily reported in the budget on information technology. And about 80% of that goes towards sustaining existing capabilities. That is not the ratio we'd like to have. We certainly, not every one of those sustaining systems is a legacy or antiquated system, but many of them are, which make them A, expensive to operate, B, often difficult to secure as well. So the IT modernization report was tasked out. It went out for public comment, so we got a couple hundred public comments. We've incorporated those public comments and are in the process of getting final sign-off from the agencies responsible for delivering that back to the American Technology Council. And essentially, a lot of what that report is focused on is how can we move the government towards shared services and towards common services. How do we essentially get parts of the government out of the business of pieces of information technology and certainly out of cybersecurity? You know, one of the challenges we have in the way our laws are set up is we expect every single federal agency to be able to protect themselves to the same degree as the next one. And so we expect the Office of Personnel Management to have the same cybersecurity capabilities that we expect of the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Defense, which is kind of crazy when you look at the way budgets are distributed and you look at the way people get distributed across the federal environment. So we really need to move toward shared services for two reasons. One, it enhances our security, and B, we can, moving towards shared services, moving towards cloud services prevents us from, as I like to say, we don't want to build the next decade's legacy systems tomorrow, right? Even if you gave us a whole bunch of money and we started rebuilding our systems, if we build them in the same manner we built them the last time, we'll just be having this problem again. And so by moving to cloud services, we can offload that to vendor community, offload that to many of you to do that sustainment and kind of normalize the costs in a far more straightforward way. Second part of the executive order is on critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure largely owned and operated by private industry, and yet without it, none of us are going to be able to operate. Our companies aren't going to be able to operate. Our houses aren't going to be able to operate. And so we have to find ways, and we believe, the administration certainly believes, we have capabilities that we can bring to bear in this space. It's very unique because it's a public-private partnership, and we have less ownership and less control. However, we've got to capitalize on the partnerships that work well. A lot of those, again, work through the Department of Homeland Security, who oversees the critical infrastructure sectors and the sector-specific agencies, as we like to call, such as Department of Energy for the energy sector. But we've got to find ways to capitalize on those partnerships that are working well and expand on the ones that aren't, or fix the ones that aren't, and create some new ones. We've got to find new ways that we can, again, bring the resources that the federal government has in cybersecurity to help ensure that our power, our water, our gas, our financials, our transportation are going to continue to operate as we need those to operate. A couple deliverables in that. One was tasked the Department of Energy to look at the electric sector and to really understand what are the potential impacts of a cybersecurity incident in the electric sector. And this is something that the industry's been looking at. However, we typically deal with, line of sight problems. Hurricanes are very line of sight problems. You can see them coming for a couple days. You generally know where they're going to go, and you know what the impact's going to be. And after you have a whole bunch of down power lines, if you string them back up, they're likely to work again. A cyber incident's very different. One is you can't see them coming. One of the things Tom Bossert, the Homeland Security advisor, talks about, in cyberspace, there are no good neighborhoods, right? In cyberspace, your adversary is as close to you as they are anywhere else. So, in the physical world, you can decide to potentially move into a nicer neighborhood or a more gated neighborhood or someplace where you're going to feel safer. In cyber, that doesn't exist. And the capabilities for our adversaries just continue to grow, and their opportunities continue to grow. So this deliverable really looked at, how do we start to diagnose? How do we assess? How do you even understand whether something is a series of glitches or when it is actually a cyber incident? And I think, as many of you know, from a forensic standpoint, the forensics in cyber incidents often takes a long time, if you even have the records and the logs and the things available to look at it. So that deliverable is in staffing. I expect that it's actually going to be one that's going to generate more work as opposed to answer a lot of questions. Unlike, I think, our IT modernization plan is a little more of an implementation plan as well. Third section of the executive order is focused on, again, international engagement. As I said, that's my peers' portfolio, but our real focus here is how do we work with our allies, how do we work with potential adversaries to really be able to set what are those norms of behavior in cyberspace? What is good behavior within cyberspace, within the free and open internet that we certainly want to maintain and keep for the country, keep for our economic prosperity, keep for our personal use? And once we establish those norms, how do we hold people accountable to them as well? As you know, attribution of who did something in cyberspace is, again, difficult, often takes a lot of time, and then policies have to be determined, or a decision has to be made. Do we even want to attribute? Is doing an attribution of a particular cyber event going to give up something that allowed us to actually identify who it was? Are we going to lose a source or a method, to use the intelligence community's parlance? So definitely someplace, however, where we have to be able to work with our international partners. We have to work with people who we sometimes consider our adversaries, just because of the pressure we need to bring in this space. The fourth area of the executive order is on the workforce. Not just the federal cybersecurity workforce, but really the workforce as a whole across the nation. How are we ensuring that we're producing the skilled people we need to protect our systems, operate our systems, and our data going into the future? And these aren't just the technologists. We need technologists. We absolutely need those people. When I was at the Defense Intelligence Agency, there were tons of people in the basement who I didn't ever want to let out of the basement because they weren't good at talking to people, but they were absolutely critical to keeping things running and operating. And we have to be able to continue to develop those skills. At the same time, we've got to find ways to ensure that everyone throughout the workforce understands cybersecurity. I think the panel was talking about, in most organizations, to have access to your computer, you have to take some cybersecurity training, some situational awareness to understand what to click on and what not to click on. That is a piece of the education. However, it really goes a lot further. Because what we need are people in the C-suite, people in our agency front offices who don't need to be cybersecurity experts. However, they have to be cybersecurity aware enough to ask the right questions, to ask their teams the right questions. And I was talking recently to someone in New York who said they got asked by the CEO, or the CISO got dragged in front of the CEO, and the CEO's question was, okay, this cyber stuff, are we safe yet? And that was the extent of the question. And the CISO's answer was, well, I kind of sort of think so. Career advice, that's not a good answer. However, I think more importantly, it wasn't a good question, right? We need far more sophisticated questions. There's no such thing as safe in your personal life, physical life. There's certainly no such thing as safe in cyberspace. And so having leadership, whether it's the CEO or the CFO or the Chief Operating Officer, able to talk to CIOs and CISOs and ask more in-depth questions about what due diligence, what due care, what steps are they taking to secure the data and information that's most critical to their organization is really the type of education we need. So building a workforce, building awareness across the entire workforce, though, is something that we've got to have to absolutely focus on. This isn't just a training, it's an education, it's a K through 12 challenge. And so there's a couple deliverables that are coming out of of that piece of the executive order, one on kind of the civilian, government and industry workforce, and what steps can we take? Can we offer additional scholarships or grants or other things? Do we need to build out curriculum in different academic institutions, or do we think that curriculum is there and we really just need to get more throughput or get more focus? We also tasked out to the Department of Defense to do an assessment internal to DoD of their workforce and really the needs that they're going to have going forward. So those are the 4 areas of the executive order. I will also tell you we are in the process of developing a cybersecurity strategy, a national cybersecurity strategy to come out. I don't have a timeline of when it's going to be out. It will certainly have elements from those 4 pieces of the executive order, and it will be informed by some of the deliverables that are coming in as pieces of the executive order. So that is in development right now inside the White House, and then we will work with interagency to be able to really, a little more solidify the direction and kind of set the work plan within cyber for the next few years. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of where we were headed, what our priorities are that we're focusing on. I'd be happy at this time to take questions if you got any specific questions, or if you want to talk about something that I didn't cover at all. So with that, any questions? No questions? Okay, then I've got a couple of things. Oh, wait. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to come up.
You're going to come up. Okay, I'm going to add a couple of things then, because I think I have a minute or two if I'm still good. So one of the things I want to ask of you, and I guess is as we look at cybersecurity, and I think that question of are we secure or are we doing the due diligence is something we look at internally to our organizations, and it makes sense. I think if you look at information technology 10 or 15 years ago, when everything in the basement failed and technology went down, for the most part, people lost email, and half the organization was thrilled and half of them were annoyed, but in general, the core mission of an entity or an organization or an agency wasn't actually at risk. A cyber incident and our dependence and reliance on technology completely changes that, right? Without technology, most of our companies will go out of business and can go out of business relatively quickly, if only for a lack of public trust. And so the what's at stake is far greater, partially because we continue to add things to our connected world, right? We continue to interconnect ourselves both personally and professionally, and we get a lot of benefits from that. However, comes with additional risk. And so one of the things that I think we need to understand is the items that we're procuring, the items that we're connecting to our systems and our infrastructure, what is the state of security with that box, that application? And quite frankly, it's really hard to figure out. It's hard for my mom to figure out, and she doesn't do technology beyond her iPad, but it's hard for me to figure out, because when you go to Best Buy or wherever as a personal consumer, or if you're buying on behalf of the government or a large organization, it's really hard to discriminate whether box A is more secure than box B, whether it's got capabilities for cybersecurity built in at the ground level, whether they're going to work out of the box or you have to get to the 27 screens in and remember to check the right 32 check boxes in order for the security to be enabled. How are those things put in place? And so there's 2 things that I think we need to do. One, for those of you that are producers of solutions and capabilities, I would ask that you pay particular attention to building in the security and delivering on the security up front. How are you delivering that? And ensuring that people know that it's there and that you're being very deliberate about providing those capabilities. But the second piece that I think we often overlook is we're all also consumers. Whether it's at work spending $90 billion on information technology, which I don't personally do, but the federal government does, whether it's you as a multinational or a small business spending some amount of money on information technology, or you as a personal consumer buying things to put in your house, we need to be more demanding and create a demand cycle for more secure and easily understood products and services. So the personal analogy I like to use is if you install a web camera in your house to see what the dog walker does in the middle of the day or what the dog is doing in the middle of the day, that's probably something many people have. My question is, how much due diligence do people go into or put into that device before they plug it into their network, before they essentially give it unfettered access to our entire digital lives, to all the pictures of our kids, to our tax returns, all the other junk that's accumulated on the hard drives or our servers or whatever computer we have in the house. And we connected this thing that was, the $29.99 one from Amazon, the cheapest one we could possibly find, and we connected it and gave it that access. I'm guessing that before you give the dog walker a key to the front door of your house, you put some amount of due diligence into, are they insured? Do they work for a company? Who is this person that I'm letting into my house? And essentially giving unfettered access to other parts of my personal life. We need to do the same in our cyber lives. We need to be demanding to help create a demand cycle so that all of us as consumers can drive that forward. Underwriter Laboratories has started some initiatives. You're probably familiar with them with all our electrical devices. And if you thought about it, you probably wouldn't buy a lamp without a UL symbol on it. You probably can't, so that's not a problem. They're doing some looking into cyber, but quite frankly, there isn't a demand cycle. And so I really would implore on you, personal lives, professional lives, to become more demanding consumers of secure products. I'm not saying everyone needs to become an expert. However, what we really need are producers to make it easier. I think that's something that we need to continue to focus on in order to really keep our society where we need it to be from a security standpoint. So with that, I'll take a question if I have time still.
First of all, thank you very much. It's terrific. A lot of good information and certainly helped me understand better what's going on at the federal level. I actually have 100 questions, but I'm just going to ask you one. You mentioned one of the roles is helping to ensure security when you were talking about critical infrastructures, and you use electrical grid as an example. And everyone in this room certainly understands that. My question is, and this may be beyond your job description, but then who's doing the coordination then? Because EMP is also a serious threat to the electrical grid. So cyber's one thing, but there are other threats as well. So yep. Is there somebody or something that's helping to do that kind of coordination? And we'll use the electrical grid as an example, but for critical infrastructures as a whole.
Yeah, so there are, within the different critical infrastructure sectors, they typically have a couple different mechanisms where they focus on. And so yesterday was a meeting of the Electrical Subsector Coordinating Council, which is an industry run, chaired by a couple, and I'm not sure how they're selected, but selected by industry CEOs of different companies who basically are looking at it from an industry standpoint of how do they work together and how can they work together on a variety of different threats. So this is some place that obviously in response to hurricanes, ice storms, other things in the electric sector, they will work together to come up with mutual agreements, pre-staged, how can they share and provide services to one another. There's also a government coordinating council for electricity as well. And so yesterday's meeting was actually the joint meeting. So we had the Deputy Secretary of Energy, we had the ESCC or the industry folks. We had about 30 CEOs or so, perhaps more, from different electric companies around the country, a number of folks from Department of Homeland Security, National Security Council, Department of Energy, talking about, and quite frankly, EMP was on the list. That was one of the topics we talked about, electromagnetic pulses, so something that could come from a solar flare, could come from a high-altitude nuclear detonation, and what would the impacts of that be on the electric grid. And so a lot of, because, and electricity is one that's a little more unique because it's also highly regulated, so there are different regulators that are also involved with that. But basically, industry is working together to do some self-regulation, to work with the regulators, to add resiliency across the entire grid, if you will. And then government comes in with what can we bring to bear. And we've got regulators who can require things, who are independent agencies, independent of the executive branch, and then we've got Department of Homeland Security that comes in. And so the financial sector, transportation, others have similar boards that are industry run, also have government boards as sort of peers, and we work together to determine, A, to share information, to share threat information, and be able to do whatever we can to help secure threat information more from a cyber standpoint, although certainly from a physical standpoint if that applies as well. So there's a lot of different moving parts to this, which is what makes some of those public-private partnerships really a great opportunity and a challenge, because whenever you have those types of entities together, you get a lot of lawyers and a lot of opinions, which are always eventually helpful, not always the most streamlined though, so. Okay, with that, thank you all very much. Thank you for your focus on cybersecurity, and have a great afternoon.